Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Beh May Ting and I'm an urban anthropologist here at the Penang Institute. Now, when we talk about food insecurity among the urban poor in Southeast Asia, we think a lot about food wastage, for example. But in a country as rich and dynamic in Malaysia, where we eat a lot of types of food, for example, the nasi lemak that I have right here, which I'm going to eat right after this video, we often forget that a lot of the urban poor in Southeast Asia face a lot of food insecurity. Now, urban poverty, despite the thought that, in the city life, there are abundance of resources, that is actually not quite true because the share of the wealth in urban areas are not as equal as we hope that it is. And on top of that, there are also always environmental factors. So when it comes to urban poverty as well as food insecurity, I would break it into 5 main factors which causes this predicament. First factor would be economic inequality and the rising cost of living. So the unequal economic growth in Southeast Asia makes the rich and the poor have a very wide gap in their income. Secondly is informal employment and economic vulnerability. So the urban poor in Southeast Asia rely heavily on informal employment, and that renders them a very precarious situation whereby there is limited job security, almost no social security, flow of food for their family. Thirdly would be urbanization and loss of agricultural land. So urban expansion in Southeast Asia means that there's a lot of land being used for development and decreasing land for agriculture, meaning in a sense then a lot of countries would depend on food imports. And what happens when there's a global pandemic, for example, during the COVID-19, is that the food supply chain gets disrupted, and this means that food prices get a shock. And when this happens, it is the most vulnerable low-income households which would suffer the greatest because of rising costs in food. Number 4 would be the access to affordable and nutritious food. So there's this phenomenon called food deserts, whereby access to nutritious food is very difficult and there are mostly only convenience stalls selling a lot of fast food, which eventually causes a chain of reaction, which causes my 5th point, which is malnutrition and health impacts. Food insecurity, it actually creates this paradoxical health issue whereby there is undernutrition, so that this would be due to the low intake of nutritious food, but there's also the issue of over consumption of junk food, which are relatively cheaper but far less nutritious, which causes a lot of lasting health impacts on the health systems in Southeast Asia. So in Penang, the situation in Penang is not as precarious as many other Southeast Asian cities, but there are still pockets of food insecurity issues for sure. And in research that we at Penang Institute did with UNICEF in this report called Families on the Edge, where we looked at how the rising cost of living has impacted low-income households in Penang, we found that nearly 28% of households reported reducing their food intake in order to cope with everyday life. This is actually quite a frightening thing to happen, seeing that Penang is always so well known for our food and cuisine. So the results from this research was actually quite alarming in a sense, because we've always had this concept that you'll never starve in Penang because of the variety of food that we have as well as the affordability. But unfortunately, this isn't exactly the realities of life for many of the urban poor here. However, it's of course not all doom and gloom, because there has been efforts undertaken in order to curb this situation, and one of it is the Mutiara Food Bank. Now, this Mutiara Food Bank is a state initiative whereby they collect surplus food from sources such as restaurants and supermarkets, and then they redistribute it to lower income households as well as associations or institutes. So there has been several immediate measures that have been taken by Southeast Asian countries to curb food insecurity, and I would divide this into four main ways. The first one would be social safety nets and food assistance programs. So for governments in Southeast Asia, and I would pick out Indonesia and Malaysia, whereby food vouchers are actually given out to the lower income households. In Malaysia, there are actually food bank programs apart from the Mutiara Food Bank program that I mentioned earlier. There's also Food Bank Malaysia, where they collect also similarly like Mutiara Food Bank, they collect surplus food, and after that they redistribute it to the underprivileged. The second example would be food fortification and subsidies for nutritional security. I would say especially in Indonesia, there's this program called RASKIN, which is Rice for the Poor program, whereby subsidized rice is given out to the vulnerable. And then the third way is urban agriculture. So countries like Thailand, Singapore, as well as the Philippines, the governments encourage urban farming as well as vertical farming. So that means that there are public vegetable patches and gardens where people can get food or vegetables to subsidize into their cooking on a daily basis, so that they don't have to spend more on buying from the markets. So there would be three main policies that I would recommend for food security for Penang's low-income households. Firstly would be to expand social safety nets and urban farming initiatives to encourage the urban dwellers to have more vertical farming or rooftop farming to add on to resources for them to get more vegetables or food. And in this case, they would have better access to fresh produce. I would actually suggest that the PPRs in Penang, which are low-cost housing schemes, to allot certain areas so that vegetable gardens can be grown, so that the people in the PPR can actually harvest some of those vegetables when they need to have extra. So it would be nice if you know that in your neighborhood you can actually harvest some of these for free. Secondly would be strengthen partnerships with the private sector. Now, we've always championed for PPP, which is the public-private partnerships. So beyond the Mutiara Food Bank, I would suggest that Penang should foster relationships with supermarkets, manufacturers, restaurants, in order to gather any surplus food and actually streamline this food collection and then distribute it to the people who need it. And finally, I would suggest to enhance nutrition education and public awareness, because we understand that everything begins with education, truly, and awareness. So educating urban communities, give them a sense of the knowledge to understand why is eating nutritious food important. And this can be done through public campaigns supported by schools, community centers, and NGOs in order to promote a balanced nutrition. That's all from me. Thank you.